I'm Reginald Lowe. I'd like to call the Panel B meeting to order. So I'd like to have Teresa call the roll.
Sure. Morning. Dr. Lowe?
Present.
Dr. Gaunadev?
Present.
Dr. Levine? Present. Ms. Pines?
Here.
And Ms. Shipsky? Here. We have a quorum.
Thank you. So I'd like to go into closed session. So all those that are not supposed to be here, can we have you exit? And when you can come back when we have open session at about 11.
11. Yeah.
Looks like we're pretty close. Why don't we have the panel members introduce themselves? Why don't we start down here with Ms. Shipsky?
I'm Jerry Shipsky. I'm Denise Pines.
Sharon Levine.
Reginald Lowe.
Dale Gaunadev.
Okay, are we ready? All the technical problems are good. Okay, so we're going to have an open session now with oral arguments on the non-adopted proposed decision on Ryan C. Peterson, MD, and I'll turn the proceedings over to Judge Yerkey.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lowe. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Amy Yerkey. I'm an administrative law judge with the Office of Administrative Hearings. May I ask counsel to state their appearances on the record, please?
Good morning, Your Honor. John DeCure with the Office of the Attorney General.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Theodore Cohen for Dr. Peterson, who is seated here to my left.
Good morning, Mr. Cohen. Good morning, Dr. Peterson. I'm going to take a moment to call the case, and then I'll go over some ground rules for the proceeding this morning. So we're here in the matter of the accusation against Ryan C. Peterson. This is agency case number 06-2011-217874, Office of Administrative Hearings case number 2012-040825. Today is Thursday, April 25th, 2013. The time is approximately 11:30 in the morning, and we're located at the Hilton Hotel in Los Angeles, California. All right, so according to the procedures for the conduct of oral arguments, which can be found at California Code of Regulations, Title 16, Section 1364.30, the arguments that we hear today shall be based only on the existing record and shall not exceed the scope of the record of duly admitted evidence. No new evidence may be heard. So there will come a time that the panel members will be invited to ask questions of either counsel or the respondent. And I'll just remind you folks that we can't ask any question that would elicit an answer that would bring us outside of the scope of the existing record. And so if I do hear a question that would call for that kind of answer, I'll just interrupt you and remind you that those questions are not permissible. Now, in terms of the timing for the arguments, again, pursuant to this statute, the respondent's attorney will go first, and sir, you'll be limited to 15 minutes. Then Mr. DeCure, you'll also receive 15 minutes. Then we'll turn back again to Mr. Cohen, and you'll have an additional 5 minutes. And then Mr. DeCure, you'll also get another 5 minutes. And then after that, Dr. Peterson, if there's anything that you'd like to say, you'll be given an opportunity to do that. And if you choose to make a statement, then I'll put you under oath at that time. All right. So we'll begin. Mr. Cohen, would you like to begin the proceeding?
Thank you very much. Is it okay if I stand maybe?
Yes, sir.
Try. It's a pleasure to be here today, and nice to see Mr. DeCure after many years. I think one of these days we're going to do away with lawyers and have the doctor just sit with the panel, you physicians and other public health members and I think after talking to him for about an hour, you're going to know a lot more about him than can come out during a trial. But that's maybe something in the future. So right now, Mr. DeCure and I are still working. During Governor Brown's original term as governor many years ago, I had the privilege of serving as a public member on the Physicians Diversion Program, which the Medical Board had established in 1980, and I did that for about 10 years, and I had the joy of seeing hundreds and hundreds of physicians who were suffering from the disease of chemical dependency come back and restore their lives and be able to serve their profession and the public once again. So I think it's fitting that the profession that is dedicated to alleviating the ills of mankind be in the forefront of helping those of its own who are suffering from this disease that they acquire through no fault of their own, because as we know in all the professions, chemical dependency is now classified as a disease. One doesn't wish to get it, and Dr. Peterson didn't wish to get it. So I think that in addition to showing the public that your mission is to protect the public, I think it's also would be important that in doing so and in carrying out that mission, that the public be made aware, and the profession is making the public aware, that people and physicians can and do recover from the disease of chemical dependency, and some recover more slowly and some recover more quickly. And I think we have a situation here with Dr. Peterson where the evidence, I don't like to use terms like overwhelming, I think the evidence was really, really credible. I wish that all of you could have been there at the hearings to hear these medical professionals and psychiatric and psychological professionals testify about Dr. Peterson's recovery. It was a stellar recovery. They said he was in the 1%. If they had to rate people in a percentage of their recovery, they would rate him as 1%. He entered into a strict, severe program of recovery, and he is, this next week, he will have 20 months of sobriety, clean and sober, 20 months since this all began. When this first happened, he immediately agreed with the Attorney General's office to surrender his license, that he wouldn't be practicing. He didn't fight the board in any way. He agreed with everything that the board wanted him to do. And he sits before you today as a physician in recovery. We have here in the audience Jim Conway, a psychologist who has worked treating physicians since the 1980s, running the groups of physicians in recovery. And Dr. Kelly, who is seated in back of me. Dr. Kelly was his employer in an anesthesiology practice, and the evidence was, and Dr. Kelly testified at the hearing, that he wants to hire him back. He's aware of his situation. He will be monitored. Dr. Peterson is undergoing propofol, I have trouble with this word, propofol glucuronamide urine test. That's a new test. They didn't have that test earlier. This is a brand new test now. And people were concerned about anesthesiologists going back into practice. And I'm happy that everybody here seems to have agreed, and that the board seems to have agreed, that Dr. Peterson is fit to go back to the practice of medicine. The only issue here today, as I understand it, is whether he should be permitted to practice his specialty of anesthesiology. And so he is now undergoing rigorous treatment. He's engaged in 12-step programs. He's taking this propofol glucuronamide. Am I pronouncing it correct, doctor? The urine test, and he's on Vivitrol, which blocks the opiate receptors. And we had Dr. Skipper, who was a renowned physician who ran the Alabama program for many, many years, the physicians program for the Alabama Medical Board, and who did many, many studies and published many studies about anesthesiologists, because the issue is, should a physician, even though he can keep his or her license, be permitted to go back to doing anesthesiology? And the record is clear that Dr. Skipper's research and published works showed that anesthesiologists are quite safe to go back to the practice of anesthesiology. He said, I think that the studies that I put forward here, that anesthesiologists can go back to work as anesthesiologists, they don't harm patients. As long as they are monitored properly, they do well. And so Dr. Skipper's publications and all the research indicates that anesthesiologists should not and need not be singled out to be restricted from practicing anesthesiology when they are recovering from the disease of chemical dependency. We also have, I think, an important letter, and it's Exhibit B in the documents that we filed, from Dr. Hartunian, who did not testify at the hearings, but he did submit an affidavit. And Dr. Hartunian, Harry Hartunian, is the director of the Physicians Recovery Program, I don't know if that's the right term for it, at the renowned Betty Ford Center in Rancho Mirage, California. Dr. Hartunian said that he worked with hundreds and hundreds of physicians, both in interventions and in treatment. And he has observed Dr. Peterson closely and intimately. And Dr. Peterson goes out there regularly to the Betty Ford Center to share his recovery experience with other physicians who are newly in recovery. This man gives to people. He is not selfish about his recovery. He shares it with others. And Dr. Hartunian believes, and he has written his affidavit, which we've attached, that Dr. Peterson is capable and competent to go back to the practice of anesthesiology. So I submit to you, the board, that we have Dr. Hartunian, who has monitored hundreds and hundreds of physicians at the Betty Ford Center, who feels he could go back to anesthesiology. Dr. Skipper, Jim Conway, and all of these experts that testified at the hearing. And then we have his employer, Dr. Kelly. I believe that that gives you and the public an assurance that Dr. Peterson is going to be monitored, he's going to be watched, he's going to be looked after. Dr. Kelly has a large practice where they furnish anesthesiologists to, I believe, 15 different surgery centers in the Los Angeles area. Dr. Kelly knows Dr. Peterson intimately. He's watched him. He's watched his recovery. He is willing to risk his business, his license, his reputation to hire Dr. Peterson back if you will allow Dr. Peterson to go back to the practice of anesthesiology. And I think that is your guarantee that the public safety is going to be looked after. The fact that Dr. Kelly, his employer, has a lot to lose if Dr. Peterson did not practice competently and adequately, and Dr. Kelly is willing to hire him, take a chance on him, give him employment, and be his monitor. That is the assurance, I believe, that the public needs to know that Dr. Peterson is competent to go back to practicing anesthesiology, and I hope that that is what the board will do. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. DeCure.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I want to start by taking you back a little bit to the proposed decision, because I think that it would be better for you to have the full context of the situation before you when you begin to consider, well, what do we do with this case? I know that's why the decision was not adopted. The question is, what should the end result be? And before I get into discussing that, I want to remind you of a few things that were factual findings that were not disputed, and certainly the respondent deserves credit for admitting to this history, but I'm going to highlight this history for you so that you have a full context of the drug addiction we're talking about. Paragraph 5 in the decision lists that in the summer of 2000, this is nearly 13 years ago, the respondent began using methamphetamine, crystal meth, and GHB, often referred to as the date rape drug. He used the GHB to counter the speed-inducing effect of methamphetamine. So this is nearly 13 years ago, the beginning of this drug use. A medical doctor who knows the effect of drugs, and he is now using two different drugs that have contradictory effects. Starting in 2005, he began to use Xanax, an anti-anxiety medication, to achieve the same results as the GHB. He reports that that was recreational. He continued to periodically use these two substances throughout med school, during his residency and fellowship. Paragraph 6 states that his first employment in June of 2009 until October 2010 was concluded when he was fired from his job after it was discovered that he diverted drugs for his personal use. In October of 2010, he was with a new group, KJD, which provided anesthesiologists on like a subcontractor basis. His meth use increased in 2010. He was now ingesting it intravenously and had 2 to 3 binges per month. He started using fentanyl, a synthetic opiate, to come down from the meth binges. His tolerance for fentanyl increased, and from May through November of 2010, he was injecting 1,000 micrograms daily. In spring of 2011, he was injecting 100 to 200 micrograms of fentanyl 2 or 3 times per week, even when not binging on meth. He occasionally used Ambien or other benzodiazepines to come down from meth binges. By May of 2011, he self-injected propofol. He used it to take away the anxiety of methamphetamine. Did so on multiple occasions over the following 13 days. And this was from May 1st of 2011. Repeatedly injected it after work. He was involved in 3 car accidents over a 4-day period while under the influence of propofol. May 13 of 2011, he injected propofol, quote, while working at the Encino Plaza Surgical Center during a lunch break between the morning surgery and the afternoon procedure. He administered anesthesia to 1 patient after having injected the propofol, end quote. At this point, he realized he'd gone over the line. He sought treatment. He went back to work in August of 2011, and in paragraph 18, it was found that he was using fentanyl and propofol at home after work. He wanted to take a couple of weeks off of his recovery. August 26, 2011, a nurse reported seeing needle marks on him. He was suspended from work. On August 29, 2011, this is paragraph 19, he went into a surgery center and stole 2 50-milliliter bottles of propofol. He went home and injected the entire quantity over the next few hours. These are all factual findings, and this is the original context from which your discipline will come. It's conceded by the medical board, I think, very reasonably. It's conceded by the complainant, that is, who I represent, that the respondent has done a good deal toward getting better. The problem is, you've got a question of, well, what do we do? Do we allow him to immediately go back to practice in anesthesia, where he will be surrounded by powerful drugs, where he has had a history of struggling, where he admittedly got treatment and came back to work in anesthesia and found the situation to be overwhelming? Keep in mind that since that time that the respondent had his relapse, he had first-rate treatment. He went to Hazelden, he went to Betty Ford, he came back and he sought support groups here, and some of the people from those from that treatment he was lining up are here today. So he was doing all the right things, but when he went back to work, it became too much, and that happened very quickly. You have to look at the time frame involved in any drug or alcohol addiction case, because you're talking about really a track record that an addict, a confirmed addict, needs to show of sobriety, of good decision making, of a stable life, and so forth. And the only thing that you can rely upon is time. I noted in my argument that one of the respondents' witnesses, Dr. Tarrington, testified As to whether or not relapses were possible or should be expected, the answer he gave was absolutely. And we did have a relapse immediately when the respondent went back to work. Another important issue involving anesthesia practice was also addressed at trial, and that had to do with whether there would be safeguards to make sure that in such a critically important role as administering anesthesia, I know you all know what that involves. That's really life and death stuff. Would he have safeguards in place to ensure that if there were a relapse, somebody would not die on an operating table? The answer is, well, yes and no. There are cameras, there's technology involving dispensing of drugs that can track how much drugs the anesthesiologist is receiving to administer to the patient and so on. But this is all fairly sophisticated, it's expensive equipment, and when asked whether these kinds of safeguards would be in place in the smaller surgical centers where the respondent would be practicing anesthesia, the answer was no, it's not likely. They would not have that kind of equipment. I think most importantly for this panel, you have to consider that we're not talking about punishment. We're talking about public protection. The board very reasonably is, or the complainant is, I believe, very reasonably suggesting not that his medical career be ended, but that the revocation of his license be stayed. The 7 years of probation is a lengthy term, certainly long enough for many years of monitoring, and God willing, the respondent will go through the entire 7-year period clean and sober, and his business with the medical board will be finished once and for all. We all hope that that will happen. But for right now, he has 20 months under his belt. He has been suspended under an interim suspension order since October of 2011. In other words, he has not yet gone back to that medical workplace where those tremendous pressures await. Not only is anesthesia difficult, it's high risk, it's very involved, it brings with it intense pressure at times, and there would be even more pressure being in a setting in which the respondent has failed before. That is why I'm recommending on behalf of the complainant that the respondent, I believe all the orders are correct, except for his ability to return with no restrictions to the practice of anesthesia. That should be withheld. He should be suspended from practicing anesthesia for another 3 years. That'll give him nearly 5 years of a clean track record. I don't believe that the public should be bearing the risk of a relapse or bearing the risk that this return to a high-pressure situation will be too soon and could be calamitous. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeCure. Mr. Cohen?
I'll just take a moment, and then Dr. Peterson's here to answer any questions you might have of him. I think that in the field of science, that it's not entirely appropriate to just set a time when people are deemed recovered. Should we say that everyone has to wait 5 years? We know that with all illnesses, and you physicians know this better than anyone, some people recover very quickly. Some people go into remission. Some people do not recover. So I think that as scientists, it is inappropriate to just say that someone should wait 5 years before they could practice anesthesia again. All of the studies by Dr. Skipper, which are set forth in his testimony and which came into evidence, indicate that people can go back to the practice of anesthesia just like they can go back to the practice in other fields of medicine. And I agree with counsel that the conditions set forth by the learned administrative law judge, who found that he should be able to go back to anesthesia, are appropriate. Perhaps the board would want him to be examined at this time. In other words, what I'm saying is we don't know when a person should or shouldn't be able to go back to their specialty again. He has not been examined recently. Perhaps the board would want him to be examined right at this moment by someone appointed by the board to see whether he can safely go back to practice anesthesia. And he is available to do that. I just want to make one more comment. Counsel pointed out in the Attorney General's brief about the thought that because Dr. Peterson attended and attends 2 AA meetings a day, that might indicate that he's fragile in his sobriety. And I submit to you that that doesn't indicate that anyone is fragile if they're attending 2 meetings a day. What it means is that they're dedicated to their sobriety, that they're willing to put their sobriety ahead of everything, and they're willing to share their experience at meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous with other people who are new in recovery. So the fact that he attends a lot of AA meetings and that he's in a lot of therapy doesn't mean he's at risk. What it means is that he's dedicated to his recovery, and he has made that a priority in his life. And he's right here with you. Answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. DeCure?
Very briefly, I think you can characterize the recovery efforts that the respondents made as being commendable, yet just the same, they are very intense. And that is because of the context I reminded you of. This is a long-term drug problem. This is a long-term history, and it involved a high level of intelligence on behalf of the respondent and an ability to be able to mix drugs to achieve a certain effect. And again, anesthesia takes Dr. Peterson right back to that medical setting in which those drugs are present and available, and it is too soon. I submit to you that you have to, when you decide what to do, you've got to use your best judgment. We don't have answers, Mr. Cohen's correct, as to how many years, how many weeks, and how many days it is before someone's cured. I think Dr. Peterson probably would agree with the statement that if you are an addict or an alcoholic and you're in recovery, you still struggle with that recovery every day, in that you have to take one day at a time. I can't give you an answer, but I can tell you that 3 years would give him a lengthy term of sobriety. He has been clean and sober for 20 months. It's not very long. He went back to work once and immediately relapsed. That should be cause for real concern. That work was not reading slides in a pathology lab. It was not doing ear, nose, and throat medicine, seeing a few patients a day. It was the pressure cooker of being an anesthesiologist and putting people under during surgeries. It is not a good mix. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeCure. Dr. Peterson, would you like to make a statement?
Sure.
All right, I'm going to swear you in. Please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth and the whole truth, so help you God?
I do.
Okay, thank you. You may be seated if you're more comfortable. And if I could ask you to pull the microphone in front of you, please. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I really don't have anything planned to say. I just, you know, in the context of the conversation, and I really appreciated what Mr. DeCure said about how addiction is treated on a daily basis. You know, I came from a really ugly place back then, and it's, you know, I read this about me, and it's all true, and I've you know, verified that at the hearing that this is what happened. I take responsibility for that, and I'm remorseful for it. It's just so ugly. I'm so grateful that there was something available to me that I could, that worked, a treatment that worked. You know, addiction is treated one day at a time, and my sobriety today is not the same as my sobriety tomorrow or yesterday. But I do have the willingness each day to wake up and do what it takes to stay sober, and that won't change if I go back to anesthesiology. I really love anesthesiology. I think that it's a career that I would have chosen all over again, even knowing what's happened to me. Luckily, there's a lot of safeguards that I can put into place. You know, this propofol glucuronide urine testing is so good. I can do that every week, and it tests for the metabolites of propofol. If any propofol was consumed in the last 5 days, it'll pick it up. Same goes for all the other drugs that I've abused, and so there's a lot of accountability that I can set up if I go back to anesthesia, if you are willing. One final thing is that I just want to make the comment that you know, this has the treatment that I do on a daily basis to stay sober from drugs and alcohol. It doesn't feel like a burden to me. This is something I've grown to enjoy. I've worked it into the very core of my existence, and I love it. And you know, that to me is the greatest gift I've ever been given. Not that I could get sober, but that I found something so good about sobriety that I want to keep it. And so with that, I will close. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir. Do any of the panel members have questions? I'll start on my left with Dr. Lowe.
Ganadev. Thank you, George. Dr. Peterson, we're thrilled that nobody got hurt. That is, there was no public harm. But what guarantee is there when you go back to anesthesia? I understand you're going through all rehab, and unfortunately you did relapse, which is not uncommon with addiction. Why do you want to go back to anesthesia so soon, which you had a problem already with a potential public harm which is serious both for you and to the public?
Before you answer that, I just need to remind everyone that we're bound by the evidence in this proceeding, so to the extent that your answer would go beyond something that's outside of what's already been presented, unfortunately, I can't have you bring that information in.
Okay, I will keep that in mind. Thank you. I want to clarify that when that relapse happened after I went back to work, I was a different person then, and I went back, every addict needs to have, I guess, a rock bottom. And that, even though it was only 4 days long, that relapse, before I bounced back to Betty Ford for another inpatient treatment session, I didn't work the recovery program then that I work now. It took that awful experience for me to have the willingness and the open-mindedness to surrender to a completely new way of thinking and a new way of living my life. And so, unfortunately, I'm so glad that nobody got hurt. I'm so glad that no patient or nobody on the road or myself, I'm so glad that nobody got hurt and there were no complaints of anything. But I wanna, it's hard for me to do this myself. It's easier when people, who treat me say it for me, but I'm really different now. And that's because of 20 months of looking back on this devastating experience, having the door be open to a new way of living, and taking that treatment one day at a time and really working it into my life. So in terms of going back to anesthesia, yes, it's a stressful career. Anesthesiologists are under stress. I've had a lot of stress, and in these past 20 months as well. I believe that if I continue to work the same program that I worked for the last 20 months, when I go back to work, I will be more than successful. There are urine, hair, nail testing, and people that I see every day that that add a safeguard of accountability. But my primary focus is on the spiritual program that has changed my life since that relapse. It's just, things are so much different now.
Any further questions from you? All right, Dr. Lowe, anything?
Well, I commend you on your recovery, and I'm curious if you were able to go back to practice as an anesthesiologist with that very busy schedule, how would that impact your ability to participate in these programs that are continuing to keep you healthy?
That's something I've given a lot of thought to, and I appreciate that question. You know, one wonderful thing about our Dr. Kelly's practice is that, you know, we're working in surgery centers. It's not a hospital-based nights, weekends call type of thing. You know, and also living in Los Angeles, there's meetings happening every hour. Almost, well, not in the middle of the night, but, you know, going till 1 a.m., there are meetings. And so, like I said before, you know, my priority is my sobriety. It will never become my career, because I know that whatever I put in front of my sobriety, I will lose. And that could be interpersonal relationships, it could be career, it could be job. Whatever I put in front of my sobriety, I will lose. And I understand that really to my core. And so, for example, I get out of work at 2 p.m. I know where the 3 o'clock meeting is, and I already go to the 7 o'clock meeting that day. My therapist has already agreed to see me on Saturdays. You know, I am in urine testing, which is I will always do after work. You know, I will keep. You know, again, it's not a burden for me. The stuff I will do to stay sober is stuff I want to do. You know, a lot of people want to go run with their dog after work, and for me, I want to go to a meeting. It really is it's a big part of my life. So
I appreciate that answer. I have one other question, and that relates to the opioid blocker. Is this something you feel like is an important part of your recovery and the need for continued use of an opioid blocker?
Yeah, well, okay, so Vivitrol is an opiate blocker that is injected into the muscle by my doctor, by my addiction medicine doctor, once a month. And that it doesn't prevent me from relapsing. You know, what the spiritual program that I've alluded to is what prevents me from relapsing. But what that drug does is that if there's a relapse on opiates, the drug bounces off the receptor, I become unimpaired, I remain unimpaired, and the drug goes into my urine where it will be picked up, and I will undergo consequences very quickly, or into my hair or nails or whatnot. Do I look at Vivitrol as a primary thing that's keeping me sober? No, I see it as an adjunct. I see it as a safeguard. I will continue to do it. I'm glad the drug exists, and I will probably stay on it for a long time, much longer than the board would require me to at this point, because I get no side effects from it, and it's an easy thing to do once a month. I hope that answers your question. It's not a primary thing for me.
Okay, thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Dr. Levine?
No questions, thank you.
Ms. Pines? No. And Ms. Shipsky? Questions? All right. Well, then at this time, I want to say thank you to everyone. We'll go off the record, and I'm going to ask the members of the audience if you could please vacate the room, and the panel will adjourn into closed session.